So, an international meeting of compassion in politics. We are incredibly excited to have you all with us. Compassion in Politics was founded in the UK in 2018, and we're thrilled, as you'll hear today, that groups are now springing up across the globe. This is the first event in what will be a series of events bringing together individuals who are working across the world to promote the case for compassion in politics. And later on during the session, we'll be hearing from 3 of them. For those of you who don't know about compassion in politics, as I said, we started in 2018 in the UK, really in the knowledge that most of the political and social injustices which blight our world share the same underlying cause, an absence of compassion, whether it's refugees dying at sea, whether it's world hunger, whether it's the terrible situation in Afghanistan, whether it's migrants fleeing, it is all linked together underneath by an absence of compassion. And we're interested in avoidable suffering that can be alleviated and what we can do about it. In the UK, since 2018, we have really got going. We're working actively with over 100 politicians. We've drafted legislation. Our research has been used in debates by parliamentarians who work to promote compassionate outcomes. And we also have launched a number of high-profile public campaigns, including one of particular relevance at the moment to stop lying in politics. We've drafted a very simple law which would bring politics into line with existing legislation on the selling of goods and services, which says that you can't deliberately misrepresent the truth. So we're just saying that that simple law should apply to politicians, and we're very excited to be working with one of the UK's political parties to try and find space and time to debate that in the UK Parliament. Anyway, back to today. We are really thrilled that Dr. Claire Yorke has agreed to give this address at our inaugural meeting. For those of you who don't know Claire, she is an author and academic researcher. Between 2018 and 2020, she was a Henry A. Kissinger postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at International Security Studies and the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University. Her writing and research explores the role and limitations of empathy and emotions in international affairs, diplomacy, strategy, leadership, and policy making. She is now based at the University of Southern Denmark. And I think writing 2 books at the same time. She's phenomenally productive and busy. And just to give you a brief overview of the format, we're going to hear from Claire for about 10 minutes. Then we're going to have time for any questions anyone wants to ask Claire. And then we're going to switch to our international members to hear from them what lessons we can learn and divine from what's been happening in other countries around the world during the period of this pandemic. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Claire. The floor is yours. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. It's always such a pleasure. And hello to everybody around the world from a rather grey and wet Denmark today. So in Easter 2020, in the first few months of the pandemic, the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, did a press conference for children to reassure them that despite the lockdown, the Easter Bunny and Tooth Fairy were considered essential workers and would still be able to travel. But, she added, he might find it a little bit hard, so they should understand if they weren't able to visit. And it was a small gesture, but a kind one, speaking directly to children and their parents, all of whom were grappling with serious lockdown, homeschooling, and isolation. And it really reiterated the simple power of compassion in politics. And I'm going to focus my comments primarily on the pandemic, because over the course of this crisis, we've seen the importance of politics and the way it touches every aspect of our lives and the very varied ways in which different leaders have responded to the crisis. So why is compassionate leadership so important? Firstly, because we notice when it is lacking. Think of the early days of the United States, and I was in America at the time. Under President Trump, there was a denial of the risks. There was a bravado about being able to handle this virus, a lack of decision-making and policies. Decisions were left to states who had to determine the best course of action. They acted too slow, without due consideration of people, with disastrous implications. Look as well at the United Kingdom. In the initial stages, there were prevarications, but very quickly they took swift action, introduced lockdowns, had a very positive experience with rolling out vaccines and care, only to be undermined very recently by reports of the hypocrisy and partying in number 10, a real lack of consideration for people and the sacrifices that people had made and had been asked to make by the very people who were drinking beers on the lawn. But when compassion is at the heart of leadership, it helps people feel more seen and more heard and that they matter. And this is what I consider integral to all the work I do on compassion and empathy. When this is absent, when people don't feel that they're seen or that they matter, they feel more isolated, more disconnected, and also more distrustful, both of those people in positions of authority and of each other. And I think it's no coincidence that we've seen over the past few years a rise in polarization, in marginalization, in discussions about divisions within society and how we're going to cure them. But when people signal they care about people and they put people first at the heart of the decisions they're taking in government, it helps to build more resilient societies. It contributes to greater trust and cohesion. And we need more trust and cohesion, both in our political leaders and our communities. And it's interesting that this week, the Edelman Trust Report was launched for 2022, and it covers 28 countries with over 36,000 participants. And they emphasize this destructive and vicious cycle of distrust that fuels disconnection in societies and hinders our ability to respond effectively to challenges. 48% of people viewed government as a divisive force in society, and 46% viewed the media as such. When we start emphasizing the importance of putting people at the heart of it and building compassion and trust and empathy, we create a more conducive environment for people to work together collectively to withstand risks and shocks, knowing that the government and the institutions are on our side. And these risks and these shocks are inevitable. They're a part of our life. We have more to come, no doubt. But if we're able to start putting this at the heart of what we do, we can move, as the Edelman report suggests, from a survival mode into a space that is much more vibrant and healthy and sustainable. Putting compassion in government also fosters a culture of listening and understanding how different people experience the world. Done properly, it contributes to more iterative, responsive, and humble forms of government and governance. And it's really interesting to see, for example, in Finland, they're exploring this idea of humility and governance and what it means in order to address the complex challenges we face. But compassionate leadership is not just about care. And this is something that's reiterated in the brilliant book that Jennifer and Matt have recently edited. Compassion is also about strength, about having the courage to do the right thing for people, even when it's hard or unpopular. And people respect that. We don't give the public enough credit to handle the complexity and the challenges of policy. But explained properly, done with care, it can be far more effective. But compassion also has to be far more than just rhetorical. We don't just want our leaders to tell us they care about us. We want them to see them deliver on it. We want them to see it matched by action and by effective measures. And that's hard. But when you align word and deed and you speak and practice care, you contribute to trust, credibility, sincerity, and far greater respect within societies. I'm going to talk briefly about the national level because it's interesting to look at those countries who fared better during this pandemic, recording lower death tolls, more compliance with the rules, and greater public trust. And they share common traits. They put people first. They are compassionate. They demonstrate and communicate they understand the situation and what they're asking of their people. They're very conscious of the sacrifices and the compromises that they are asking people to make. They communicate clearly and as transparently as possible, addressing crises calmly, but acting with urgency, demonstrating simultaneously reassurance and commitment. They use the data and science to support their decisions. They defer to experts and their insights and don't need to be the only voice of authority in the room. They reflect and adapt as understanding changes. We all don't know what we're dealing with here. It's very new for everybody, but that ability to change, to adapt, to iterate is so critical. So they learn from their mistakes, they reflect on what works, and they internalize and apply why that is. They also realize the wider societal impacts of their policy. It's not just about a health crisis. They think about well-being, mental health, schooling, welfare, inequality, homelessness, and then they work to address that. And crucial is that they have integrity. If they ask you to observe the rules, they do so too. They fulfill on their promises and they explain their thinking. And certainly no leader has been perfect, no country has got it absolutely right, and compassion alone cannot solve the problems we face. But we really need to think about it at a national and an international level. And at an international level, we've seen that it's not just been about a health crisis. It's revealed systemic and structural inequalities and socioeconomic and political failings around the world. In July 2021, last year, former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark reported to the UN General Assembly as part of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, it's quite a mouthful, trying on how to avoid a repeat of the crisis. And they reflect that it's shown the importance of multilateralism, of global leadership, of whole of society and whole of government approaches. And I would argue that compassion for all citizens is key to that. And in September of last year, we also saw Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, give a passionate and powerful address about the importance of caring for all countries and ensuring access to vaccines and care. These are conversations we have to be having at a global scale. What does compassion look like and how do we internalize it? Just yesterday, a report from Oxfam highlighted how the incomes of the world's 10 richest men doubled, while the overall income of everyone else fell during this pandemic. More people have been pushed into poverty. It has exacerbated inequality, and the proportion of people who die from the virus in the developing world is roughly double that in the developed world, though I don't like that terminology too much. This is why it's so important to have these networks and movements like Compassion in Politics. We need compassion and understanding, not just nationally, but internationally. And as my final point, I want to argue that we need to look beyond our political leaders. The future of politics is local, and we need to talk about what this means for how our media report, for our social media environments and the standards we expect from new technology and media platforms. But also we need to talk about what we can do, both to hold politicians to account, but also demonstrate that we want something different. We have a stake, all of us, in creating a more compassionate society. Some of the real leaders of the pandemic have been within our communities, the people stepping in, working overtime to ensure the vulnerable and the sick are cared for, the teachers and parents who are working remotely to make sure that students still get an education and don't miss out on too much, the friends and neighbours who leave food on doorsteps, who check in on us, the people leading national campaigns to ensure that no one goes without and that everybody is cared for. And through this pandemic, we've seen the very best of human nature as well as facing challenges. And we have to harness this to contribute to a better, healthier and kinder political ecosystem. And that is something that all of us can contribute to. We should move away from the idea that politics is what happens in the capitals and realise it begins with each of us. Our small steps, the actions we take in our homes and our networks and our communities, so it expands to become a cultural change. And I say this with hope, but I am under also no illusions about what it takes. Bringing about this change is not just about being nice or being kind, as the book also reiterates. Creating a more compassionate politics is hard, just as it can be hugely rewarding. It can be uncomfortable and challenging. We have to start having difficult conversations, listening to different sides of the debate. setting our own boundaries firmly, but in ways that are still respectful, to start to build that constructive political space. And it's encouraging to see so many people in this space trying to do exactly that. But we have to be able to put these ideas and values and principles in practice to really see something very different come out of this whole experience. As much as we need to process the past few years and what we've experienced and the grief and trauma that has accompanied so many of the challenges we've faced, it's clear we have to rethink politics, create a more constructive and compassionate political culture to facilitate the leadership we need for the future. And with that, I will hand over for questions. Thank you so much.
Claire, thank you so much. That was incredibly enlightening and also uplifting. And, you know, you talked about what we can do at a local level as well as a national and a global level, and how important these conversations that we're having today are. Before I get to the question that's already been posted, I'm curious about your own research, because you are speaking to leaders across the world about the role of empathy and compassion. And I wondered why it is that some leaders, and you talked about New Zealand and the Bahamas, are able to speak from a place of compassion, and other leaders, despite the benefits that you outlined, find it so hard to speak from that place or to act from that place?
I think there's a number of reasons. One is, I think they are committed to a different way of doing politics. And it's interesting to read a number of the reports coming out of New Zealand, where they're really talking about, we need to do politics differently. They're doing a huge amount to incorporate Indigenous communities in rethinking the future of New Zealand. They're putting ideas of kindness and empathy at the heart of the economy, and really challenging a lot of the basic assumptions that we've had of how politics should function. This idea that it should be nasty, brutish and short, or just about interests, or just about the economy. And I think it's really encouraging, but it takes brave and courageous leaders to say, we can do this differently. And I think people as well, like Prime Minister Mia Mottley, are also reflecting on a period right now where people are saying, enough, we need to have more voices in this space, we need to have more equality and equity, and we need to be able to all take part in the discussion, because the challenges we face, not just the pandemic, but climate change, inequality, are global challenges that really require collective solutions. And we have to find ways to do that far more effectively.
Thank you. And now I'm going to come to some of the questions that have been posted, some wonderful questions. This is from Mira. How would you say compassion in leadership and society during the pandemic compares to other times in world history, like the world wars or other pandemics?
It's a really great question, because we look for different things from our leaderships at different times. And this is why I think it's not just about compassion, it's also about that idea of strength. Because during a war, you want to see that your leaders are looking after you, but you also want to see they're taking action to protect you. And so then, are they also taking that decisive action? Are they also doing what's needed to fund the military, to provide on the home front, to make sure that people feel secure and protected? And I argue that ideas of empathy and compassion, this constant dialogue that exists between the public and the politicians, should be a constant throughout. But maybe certain traits get amplified at different times. But part of what I'm looking at, especially with the book on leadership, is how does that vary with different circumstances? When you've got a natural disaster, that's different from a war, which is different to a terrorist attack. So what do we ask for, and why is that? And how did the leaders step up in the moment?
Wonderful. And we've got a question, quite a few questions here about, you talked about the divisive nature of politics. And one question from Tim M is, how can we get away from the left, right, liberal, conservative labels in this approach, which, you know, have led to this polarization, or certainly amplify the polarization as people identify with opposing groups?
Yeah, again, another great question, because we have seen this idea of division, this experience of division really exacerbated over the last few years. One of the key steps I believe we need to be taking is rethinking our electoral systems. It's very hard to escape a binary if you see it replicated in your political chambers. And it's fascinating that I've come from the UK and US and then to Denmark to see the change in how those systems work, because in countries where you have more proportional representation, you've got a greater emphasis on dialogue, on finding compromise, and a greater acceptance of the need for compromise within the public. You know your party is not going to have an absolute mandate. You're going to have to give and take a little bit. So we need to see a real move towards updated electoral processes that reflect the societies that we have. But we also, I think, have to get better at talking to people who vote differently to us, and to actually understanding why they vote that way and finding what we have in common. Because we all share very similar beliefs in the importance of our family and friends, wanting to have a secure home and well-being, and finding the shared humanity that we all have is, I think, really key in that.
Thank you. And now we'll take a question from the Q&A function, which is also live at the moment. This is from Yves Grandin. Sometimes the public think that a compassionate leader is just trying to build up political capital. So how do we get round the fact that it may be a manipulation or seen as a cynical maneuver? And how can an opposition party build a force for compassion when they're in opposition and they don't have power?
So on the first point, this goes to what I was saying about the need for integrity. If you speak about the power of compassion, you have to match it with action that realizes that compassion. If you say you care about people, do something about it, because otherwise it looks rhetorical and we lose faith very quickly if it looks like an empty promise. But then for the opposition, I think the opposition has this amazing freedom to put forward new ideas and to really imagine what would a compassionate society look like, and to then have some of those dialogues and conversations, to then bring in some of the ideas and test them, and also show that with the manifesto, with the platform they develop, that they too are aligning this idea of care with concrete policies and steps that says, we understand what our public are going through in a way that the current government doesn't. And this is how we're going to counter it. These are the compassion gaps that we see. This is how our government is not looking after the people. This is how we're going to address it. And then you start to build much more of an understanding and demonstrating that you mean what you say and you've got a plan to deliver.
Wonderful. Now I've got a question from Emma Jackson, which is about what actions that are taken at a grassroots level can impact compassion at a national level. For example, is there any research on the use of citizens' assemblies and whether that informed society to have a more compassionate approach? Yeah,
there's some really exciting initiatives at the grassroots level that are doing these citizens' assemblies. There was one around the COP26, really getting people galvanized to talk about the future of the environment. And that's such a vital voice, giving real insights into how people experience policy and what they want to see. There's a really interesting book coming out in March by John Alexander on citizens and what that means, and this idea that we need to move more towards being engaged in our politics. It's not just something we consume. And also there's some great grassroots initiatives here. I met with one in Aarhus in Denmark, run by Paul Nathorpe and others, who really focus on investing in people being part of the change. And that then helps people get greater ownership over their area, over the challenges they face. It empowers people. And I think all of us want to feel empowered in our daily lives. So it's really encouraging. I don't necessarily have facts and figures at my fingertips on the impact of citizen assemblies, but it's definitely something I'm looking at, because I do think they give a voice to so many of us who want to be a part of finding the solutions and building something better.
Thank you. And then a question here from Matt, which you've partly already addressed, about, if different, I guess, democratic systems. So we have the first past the post, as you mentioned here, as in the US, and to what extent can one determine how compassionate society is by looking at, for example, its electoral system or the number of different parties that exist?
I think there is some brilliant political science research to be done on that, about the kind of correlation between that. I do think like I said, I do think that the more consensus and compromise you build into politics at every level, the more tolerant and understanding we become that is the way political culture works. And when it becomes this binary, it's us or them, it's very much oppositional, you attach such a strong identity to it, rather than maybe focusing on the issues that unite you with others and the things that you have in common. So mine is only an intuitive guess, but I imagine that those societies with more consensual electoral systems are probably more predisposed to compassion, because they're more used to living with the discomfort of difference, because it is often uncomfortable when we're outside our kind of normal zones, or challenged our identities or our values, and that's something that we need to get better at.
And can you say something about the role of gender in different models of leadership?
Yes, it's striking. And there were a number of papers written on this last year, especially, and the year before, about how it's been seen that women are much better at compassionate leadership. All the examples I've cited, I note, are women. But I actually don't think women are intrinsically more compassionate than men. And I think there's a danger that we create this gender divide. Because actually, I think we're more conditioned to think of others because of the way society constructs some gendered roles. But we also need to be empowering men to be able to reflect that side of them. I think it's interesting to see, for example, Joe Biden ran on a platform of empathy, President Biden. President Obama spoke about the empathy deficit within society. Nelson Mandela, former President Nelson Mandela, was very committed to the idea of inclusion and equality and empathy. So it's not just a female trait, but I think women are really able to show it right now because they no longer view it as a weakness. They've discovered the strength that they have when they care. And the pandemic has really revealed that when you have a health crisis, you want people to care for you, just as if you were sick and at home. You don't want someone being firm and strong. You want someone who looks after you and takes your health seriously. So the gender dimension is really important, but it's quite complex, I think, in some ways as well.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, what we know from child psychology is that all children at the age of roughly between 1.5 to 3 have an empathetic response to the suffering of another, and that's a universal non-gendered response at that age. Now, it is time to hear from members, representatives from the international compassion in politics community, who are going to be talking about their government's responses, what's happened in each of their countries in terms of leadership and how compassionate or otherwise it has been in response to the pandemic. And we're going to start with Cristiano Ramalho, who joins us from Brazil.
Thank you, Jennifer. I wrote down some few words. My name is Cristiano. I'm talking from Brazil. And first of all, I want to thank you, all my friends from Compassion in Politics Brazil, Karine, Gabriela, George, Mila, and Walker. I would also like to thank you, Jennifer, Matt, and Mira, for your energy and enthusiasm. Thank you, Claire, for your kind words, and it's very inspirational. Well, for all of those who don't know, Brazil is a country with 214 million people population. Our territory is 35 times more than United Kingdom, and our most famous cities maybe are Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, but actually our capital city is Brasilia, where I speak now from. Well, the management of pandemics in Brazil looks like a horror movie. According to BBC, Latin America and Caribbean together account for more than 52 million cases of COVID. In Brazil, we are responsible for more than half of this. We actually had until now 23 million cases and more than 6,200,000 deaths. There is an even greater number of bereaved people, parents who had lost their children and children who had lost their parents. Our president, Jair Messias Bolsonaro, who assumed the presidency in 2019, is negatively famous for his lack of compassion, apology for violence, and his anti-science stance. I brought some of his most infamous quotes in chronological order. April 2020, at the beginning of the first wave, when Brazil reached 5,000 deaths, Bolsonaro said, quote, "I'm not a grave digger," end of quote. Late in the same month, a journalist questioned Bolsonaro about the deaths, and the president replied, quote, "So what? I'm sorry. What do you want me to do? I'm Messiah," this is Bolsonaro's second name, "but I can't do miracles," end of quote. In November 2020, he says, quote, "I'm sorry for the dead. I'm sorry. We are going out to die one day. Everyone here will die. There's no point running away from it, running away from reality. You need to stop to being a country of queers." In November 2020, we had 163,000 deaths. In 2021, Bolsonaro made more than 1.3 thousand statements about COVID containing information that the source deemed faked or distorted. Last election poll says that Bolsonaro still has about 24% of the population supporting him. Well, that is the bad news. About the good news is, here we will also have our version of NHS, the SUS, Universal Healthcare System, that was created in 1990, a few years after our newest constitution. And despite the government propaganda against science and vaccines, the SUS had applied more than 309 million vaccines right now. We have more than 70% of our population fully vaccinated. The children's vaccination started last Monday, and out of 10 parents want their kids vaccinated. We are all tired and scared, but despite this, the chief of state will still move on based on compassion and common humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for providing something to counter those extraordinary remarks from your political leader there, and thank you for all that you're doing to introduce more compassion. Now we're going to move the beauty of Zoom to Argentina. Pablo Soria joins us from there. Over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation, and thank you, Claire, Matt, and Jennifer for this wonderful panel. I give you some keynotes about an Argentine look. I hope it will be a little bit sad, like a tango, no? I expect more joy about Brazil, but Argentina is the same. When the COVID pandemic was announced in March 22, Argentina was already in a very different economic situation, characterized by very high inflation, recession, low rate of foreign investment, and external payment balance crisis. The annual inflation during the pandemic period has grown from 38.9% in 22 to 50.2% in 23. 2021. 1,020 Argentines has died from the COVID. The huge fiscal deficit, which for decades was not being faced by government, is one of the main causes of this unfortunate situation. The government response to the pandemic, like many countries, was a greater monetary emission destined for social expense. This social expense failed to reduce the significant increase in poverty, which reached in December 2020 to the 43% of the population. Political leadership in COVID times. In the first months of the pandemic, the political leadership reached a high consensus that strict rules of the isolation were necessary. United by fear, politicians failed to consider the social and political cost of a general lockdown of the economy. After 3 months of strict sanitary isolation, the opposite party disagreed with the extreme social isolation, especially when the closure of school was extended. This motivated that the Supreme Court of Justice ruled that opening of school in the city of Buenos Aires. Argentine structural problems such as poverty, recession, and insecurity were exacerbated by the pandemic. Unfortunately, education inequality became worse in the most vulnerable family. Compassion and COVID. The COVID crisis acts as a magnifying glass that has shown the good and especially the worst of many political behavior. Unfortunately, the lack of compassion and empathy has prevailed when facing the suffering of the population. I give you 2 examples, one negative and one positive, because of course I hope that we are right now people with the full of hope. The first one, the negative, lack of the integrity of the president. The president has been criminally denounced for having held a social gathering, his wife's birthday, in the presidential residence at the strictest time of the most severe isolation. That is the similar case, I think, it's an opinion that one time Friday, I think. Well, the positive case, at the beginning of the pandemic, a renamed senator, Stefan Bullrich, was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a very serious illness. He decided to resign to his Senate bench to dedicate more time to his family. In his resignation speech, he highlighted the need of an authentic dialogue and a composite view of politics. I will send you the link. It's in Spanish, but with subtitle, English subtitle. It's very, it's wonderful, the way that expressed this idea about compassion. Conclusion, even so the pandemic awake civil solidarity, the political leadership has failed to generate sincere dialogue and put in practice good values. I think that a platform like Compassion in Politics is an urgent and necessary tool to collaborate in the formation of positive values in politics. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Fascinating and depressing in equal measure. Mira Borggreen joins us from Denmark. What's happening there? Oh, you're muted.
Unmuted. I'm here. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everybody for being here today. Yes, I want to tell you a little bit about the pandemic and compassion in Denmark. So overall, Denmark has done pretty well during the pandemic. We are currently in our 3rd wave and the end of our 3rd lockdown, which has been the biggest when it comes to daily cases, peaking at around 33,000 yesterday. but we also have a vaccination rate of 80% for the second dose, 55% for the third dose, and we are introducing a fourth dose this week. So the vaccination and test efforts overall have been pretty successful, and the overall numbers of deaths in Denmark is 3,500. We have a female prime minister. Her name is Mira. She is a social democrat in charge of a minority government, and I would say she has generally led the country with a steady hand during the pandemic. Touching on some of the things Claire said earlier, we've gotten used to weekly press conferences, live press conferences, where experts and health professionals always flank the politicians. So a lot of time and efforts have been put into communication, including letting the children's paper attend a press briefing earlier last year. And the Prime Minister has also done specific content on social media with young influencers, like Instagram Lives, to explain about the pandemics and the importance of being tested and vaccinated. The general trust in government and the national health authorities has been a big deciding factor as well, and the general trust in the government and the health authorities is very high in Denmark. If we go back to 2020, during the very first press conference that was held on March 11th, our Prime Minister introduced a new norm for all Danes, and she said, quote, "As Danes, we must usually seek community by being close together. Now we must stand together by keeping apart. We need samfundssind," end quote. So this new norm, samfundssind, consists of the Danish word samfund, society, and sind, mind. And that dates back to the late 1930s. Samfundssind appeals to the collective responsibility and community spirit, and it is closely related to solidarity. The term was previously connected to how Danes and the Danish society approached life during the Second World War. And in 2020, it was also named Word of the Year. Samfundssind during the pandemic has meant that people in large numbers have volunteered to pick up medicine and food for strangers. A lot of people have formed online support communities. And because sing-alongs have always been a way of connecting people in Denmark historically, Danes began to gather around TV screens to sing together apart. So especially during 2020, more than 200,000 Danes would attend daily sing-alongs for 15 minutes every morning, and more than 1 million would tune in on Friday evenings for a national sing-along. Even the Prime Minister participated and posted herself on Instagram singing along while she was doing the dishes on a Friday evening in April of 2020. So overall, samfundssind and a high trust in government has meant that Denmark has managed to make it through the pandemic with a high level of compassion in politics and society. But in November of 2020, a new mutation of COVID-19, known as Cluster 5, was detected among minks, leading the Danish government to order the culling of all 17 million minks in Denmark. A commission is now reviewing the decision, as it turned out that the government did not have the necessary legal authority when they announced the culling, and that really hurt the Prime Minister's credibility and the overall sense of transparency and political cooperation. In November of 2021, the Prime Minister and her party faced the consequences when they lost about 10 points in all of the biggest cities during the local election. But if we look at the situation today in January 2022, I would say that the support for the Prime Minister and the general trust in her way of handling the pandemic seem to have bounced back, because the national polls currently has the opposition at a 0.3 gain since the 2019 election, which is quite small compared to the 10-point loss last year. And there isn't a national election until next summer. So right now it looks like she has bounced back. I think that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I just have to ask whether any of the songs in the sing-along would be ones that we all know?
A lot of them were Danish because that's kind of what connects us. Yeah, I think it was all kinds of sing-alongs, and they would invite, they couldn't invite people because people were home, so they would set up cameras in famous singers' homes, and they would sort of like assume sort of by turn they would sing a song, and then everybody would sing along. Yeah. I will try to maybe send or post a clip somewhere for you to see.
That would be uplifting. That would be wonderful. And now, last but not least, we come to my co-director at Compassion in Politics in the UK, who is going to say a few words about the leadership here during the pandemic.
Thanks, Jennifer. So in comparison to Mira's description of the relatively steady hand in Denmark, I think Britain has largely, the UK, actually largely Britain, has convulsed from crisis to crisis throughout COVID. When our current health secretary, Sajid Javid, took over the role in the summer of last year, he quite clearly stated that there would be no going back. And by that, he meant no going back in terms of introducing any restrictions or changes to the policy, which was to essentially to try and pretend that COVID was over. But I think it also encapsulates, in a strange way, the government's approach to the crisis throughout, in that actually what they have been quite keen on doing is going back to pre-2020 without learning any of the necessary lessons that we could have picked up throughout this whole affair. Where Britain currently stands at the moment, or the UK rather stands at the moment, we have the 7th highest total death toll in the world at over 150,000 deaths. One thing that perhaps we haven't picked up on yet as well is the fact that there is a huge inequality in how those deaths have occurred. They've been concentrated amongst Black and ethnic minority communities, amongst deprived communities, and of course amongst those with pre-existing health conditions and with disabilities. Having initially pursued a very hard approach in terms of vaccine rollout and quite trying to trumpet the fact that the UK was ahead of the world in its vaccine distribution, we have now fallen to 13th in the world for getting the 2 jabs out, where 76% of the population currently has been vaccinated. And it's interesting to think how in the last month or so in the UK, the government has very successfully portrayed avoiding the collapse of our National Health Service as a major victory, when in fact that should really be seen as a very basic requirement from of delivery from our government. I just wanted to pick up on 3 key themes and then 3 key lessons before we return for questions. I think one major theme has been the sense of a lack of collectivism, and there's quite strong research emerging now which does show that countries, as Mira described, as Claire described, where there is a strong sense of the collective and people looking out to their community rather than inwards at their own state of affairs, have done a lot better in responding to COVID. And very visually, we have seen that in the Downing Street parties that Claire mentioned, the very strong protests against the idea that our freedom was being inhibited by the introduction of the vaccine or by the introduction of lockdowns. That isn't to say that we don't have to try and understand or sympathise or empathise with those people who hold that view. I think it's just a very strong indicator of how Britain is very much, has been a country which has emphasised the individual over the collective. And we are now also seeing divisions start to emerge, this sort of sense of a culture war over vaccines, over mask wearing, over lockdown, in attacks against the scientists themselves who have introduced these policies. Second key theme has been, as I stated at the outset, this unwillingness of the politicians to bend and to be flexible. We've seen that both in policy, although there have had to be a number of U-turns, but also quite crucially in style. Claire said one of the main factors that we've seen in some countries has been leaders who've been prepared to say, we simply don't know, we are trying this out, we're doing the very best we can, but this is an unknown virus. It's not really a theme that we've seen in the UK, where politicians have had to maintain a very bombastic line, something that the media has to take some blame for, but also politicians and their style of leadership as well. But I think thirdly, and this is where an optimism comes in, I think the politicians have actually been out of touch with the public a lot of the time, though perhaps not so much recently, where you failed to see that collectivism amongst politicians. We had mutual aid societies created by communities, streets organising to support their neighbours who couldn't get access to food or to medical supplies. So there has been demand from the public to introduce lockdowns when the government have actually been quite unwilling. I think they really didn't expect the population to be where they were in terms of their views on COVID. Trying to bring that into some lessons now. I think, as I say, language and words really do matter, and emphasising our collective faith, our need for mutual interdependence is really important, and getting politicians to a state where they feel able to articulate that kind of vision, those values, and that language is going to be really important. And if we don't, I think we will descend further and further into a cultural war of us against them, division, rather than sharing in common humanity and a common fate. I think the positive is, again, the realization that people are very willing to change when they believe that there's a very strong reason that they should do so. One of the things that our leaders here in the UK failed to do was to take that opportunity that was presented by the upheaval of the pandemic and actually introduce some real positive change. We did polling which showed that the vast majority of the public want the same type of energy that was shown in responding to COVID to be used in responding to the climate breakdown. And I think we can, as long as we understand that we articulate reason and an emphasis and a motivation for change, the public can and will go with us. And as I say, linked to that, therefore, leadership really does matter. Taking a strong stand when it's necessary, being prepared to sometimes say the uncomfortable things, or at least to express the truth and to speak with honesty is absolutely vital, and to take a steer when it matters. So I hope that's a sort of helpful contribution to the discussion, and we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Thanks so much, Matt. And one question I've got for the panel is the extent to which the pandemic has increased or reduced division in their individual countries. What is the impact of the pandemic been on levels of division within society in the various countries that you're from? Don't know who wants to go first.
I'm happy. Oh, Pablo,
yes, I think that the pandemic crisis increased the division, because it's a difficult situation that put on the best and the worst, and I think that the political view is a little bit worse after the pandemic.
Anyone else? Matt?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I think, as I was sort of indicating, there's been a sort of chronological change. I think at the start there was a huge sense of togetherness and willingness to change and to come together in the mutual aid societies. But now tiredness has set in. We've seen a distinct lack of leadership to point anyone in any particular direction. There's this huge desire to go back to business as normal, and that's all starting to fragment, and people really are, we are getting a sort of COVID culture war in Britain, which is really ironically hampering any real effort to get back to normal.
I think in Denmark we're seeing something similar. There was a lot of support for the political leadership. There was a lot of support for Samfundssind to begin with, but I want to say during the last 6 months, in particular, since the Commission on Mink was established, we've seen more sort of division. We've seen the opposition not voting for all the restrictions, and we've seen more sort of talk and criticism from different parts of the society and citizens as well when it comes to restrictions, masks, vaccinations. So I think it's also kind of like fatigue of the whole situation.
Thanks. Cristiano, how is it in Brazil?
Yeah, I feel the same in Brazil. At the very beginning, we have this wonderful initiatives, the people gathering to help each other. And after some time, we have this feeling of a general tiredness or something like that. and I think this there's no coordination at all from our leaders. So this could help to this this movement not go any further.
Thank you. And Claire, I just wondered if you had a global view on what it's done. Has it brought nations together or further apart?
I think at a global level, the similar trends that all the panelists have mentioned are being replicated. And part of that is because of our interconnected communities and societies. You get these global movements either against vaccines or in support of vaccines. We find community in different spaces now. And so that division is replicated. And it's interesting that even in places like New Zealand, that has had in many perspectives quite a compassionate approach, very decisive, very low numbers of fatalities, is still experiencing these divisions and these tensions as increasing protests. And I think it speaks really to partly the uniqueness of the situation and the challenges of being in this sense of uncertainty for so long. And so any leader that wants to kind of move us through the recovery is going to have to be very eloquent and very conscious of the grief and the trauma and the experience that people have had, and really speak to that. And in some ways, I'm so pleased to see that we're talking far more openly about well-being and mental health. That's one of the kind of silver linings of the pandemic, that we're much more conscious of our need to exist in communities and our need for connection. But you need someone who is going to be able to introduce measures to really put that into practice and help people process it very proactively, so that you have bottom-up initiatives meeting top-down, because otherwise these divisions are going to become more exasperated, far more extreme, and I don't think we can afford that right now. It's too febrile in some places.
Thank you so much, and I'm afraid that is all the time we've got time for here, but please do continue the conversation online. We're on social media, or do drop us a line at Compassion in Politics. And if you are from another country where things are happening, where you're interested in starting up your own group of Compassion in Politics, or where you think interesting for a future event, please do get in touch, and I'll put Mira's email in the chat, as she is our international coordinator. But reach out to us if you don't have time to jot it down through compassioninpolitics.com website as well. And you know, it's clear that we all have a lot of work cut out for us, but there is only one way of making things improve. And I just wanted to finish with a quote from the American activist Marian Wright Edelman, which I'm going to adapt slightly for our purposes. You just need to be a flea for compassion. Enough committed fleas biting strategically can make even the biggest dog uncomfortable and transform even the biggest nation. So let's all go out and do what we can for compassion. Thank you so much. Thanks to our amazing panelists. Thank you to Claire for a fantastic talk. Thank you to Mira for organising this. And I wish you all the very best wherever you are. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Lovely to join you.